Ever see a reference photo that makes you think, oh, that's way beyond my skill level? Today, I'll prove step by step that this serene water scene is completely within your reach using techniques you probably already know.
Part 1, Lesson 1, the sky. Using a chip brush, I'm laying down some clean water onto the paper so I can work wet into wet. The blue that I'm using is a combination of cobalt blue and manganese blue hue. To paint the water, I'm also laying down clean water first so I can work the color of the water wet into wet. Now we're ready to paint the water. I've switched to a Princeton Neptune quill size 8 to brush in the water. I'm using the same colors in the water as the sky, which is going to be cobalt blue and some manganese blue hue, but what I want to achieve is a darker value in the water than the sky. If you look at water that reflects anything, the colors in the water are almost always darker than the colors of the actual objects. This is a gradient wash, but notice how I'm not being super perfect about it. It is water, there is going to be some movement. Seeing the brush strokes helps define that movement of the water. Now I'm mixing up some gray, which is a combination of cobalt blue and burnt sienna, to paint the distant hills. Notice how I'm painting the hills right over the tree trunks. This won't be a problem because the tree trunks will be very dark and the bluish gray will not interfere with the color of the trees. To build a little bit of depth into the hills, I'm dropping in a darker value of the gray. This is wet and wet. So I see I need a little more sky, so I'm brushing in some sky color here. Think about what I've done at this point. I've done sky, water, and some distant hills using wet into wet, some flat washes, and then some wet into wet into the flat wash. If those techniques are still difficult for you, then I recommend watching this video on doing flat washes. I'm mixing up some undersea green and shadow green to paint the midground hills. This starts out as a flat wash. The gray hills are still a little bit wet, and that allows these closer hills to blend and bleed into those hills, and that helps unify the painting. I'm painting this midground hill up to the water garden. I'm trying to allow that green color to merge into what's going to be the garden. I'm trying to use a damp brush to soften that edge, but it was a little on the wet side, so I'm getting a blossom or cauliflower. That cauliflower won't interfere because of the later painting that I plan to do. I'm dropping in a darker green value wet into wet. I hope you can see how just these few skills that we've used so far are really not that hard. If you know how to do these, you can do this. You can do this painting. I've mixed up some green for the grass that is in shadow of the trees, and it's a combination of Serpentine Genuine and shadow green. I'm splattering what I thought was clean water to be ready to paint the leaves and trees. Using a combination of shadow green and Serpentine Genuine, I'm using what's called a scumbling technique, where I drag with the very tip of an Escoda liner brush the pigments so that they start to blend themselves on the paper. This will suggest branches full of leaves without having to paint each and every leaf. Notice how I started with the leaves and then I start to paint in the tree trunks. And yes, the tree trunks are going to be green instead of brown. The very dark green you see that I'm dropping in wet into wet is shadow green. When you've placed pure pigments on the paper, wet into wet, where they can blend together themselves, tilting the paper is a really wonderful way to get blending that make the colors look very natural. Letting the paint run together gives you natural gradients, and you can get a suggestion of light filtering through the leaves. I'm checking to see if the paper is dry where those mid-range hills are, because I intend to pull the pigment for the tree trunks down. If the hills are still wet, those trunks are going to bleed into the background, and I want them to have a sharp edge, and I won't have a sharp edge if those hills are still even slightly damp. Okay, the paper's dry now. Now I can pull down the tree trunks. Now that the tree trunks are complete, those will lead directly into the grass. I'm using diluted shadow green for the grass, and this will allow me to go back and drop in darker pigment to show the shadows of the leaves on the grass. While the grass in the shade of the trees is still wet, I'm coming back with Serpentine Genuine to paint in the grass that's in the sunlight. By laying in this flat wash of sunny grass while the shaded grass is still wet, there isn't a hard line between the two shapes. They blend together at the border. Notice also how the right side of the trees is blending into what will be the garden, which I'm starting now. In this section of the painting, I'm going to be using a combination of wet on dry and wet on wet. I'm still using the Escoda liner brush because the tip is a little bit floppy and it makes the marks a little random, a little unpredictable, and that's more natural. I'm still using shadow green, Serpentine Genuine, and now I'm adding in some burnt sienna. See where the arrow is pointing? That's the section of the garden that I'm painting right now using Serpentine Genuine. I'm not going for an exact rendition of what I see in the photo. It'll be fairly close, But the marks I'm making are to try to suggest the grasses and give the viewer just enough information to see what's there without stating everything. I've switched from working wet on wet to wet on dry to try to show the stalks of the tall grasses. The arrow shows where I'm painting in now, that section of grass that's in shadow just to the left of the golden flowers. Using yellow ochre, I'm now adding the golden flowers, but I'm doing it in more than one place, and that'll help spread the colors of the painting around and give it unity. I'm dropping in Hansa yellow light to brighten up the golden flowers. I'm dropping shadow green into the base of the flowers to give them, well, shadows. I'm going through this section slowly because I want you to see that, again, this is a repeat of skills that hopefully you already know, using wet on wet and wet on dry, with an emphasis on wet and choosing to take pure colors from the pans to let them blend with the other colors already on the wet watercolor paper. Though this composition is complex, particularly the garden, by choosing these skills and utilizing these skills, it makes many subjects accessible even for people without a lot of experience in watercolor. This is Undersea green. When I took this photo, I really thought it was beautiful, and I've wanted to paint it for years. So I wish I had known then, I wish somebody had explained to me then what it would take to paint this scene. And it's interesting now, going over this and explaining the steps, what it really took was the same kinds of techniques over and over, just a few of them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'm spritzing some water so that I can do scumbling on the right-hand side like I'd done on the left-hand side. Now, certainly feeling intimidated by a composition isn't a good feeling to go into it. You need a plan, and I had a plan when I did this. So if this really is something that is too much to take on right now, do a simpler composition. I have other videos that you can look at that are simpler. And believe me, even a failed painting has good parts. I know sometimes that's hard to believe because you look at the painting and you think, oh, I hate it. I hate it. Well, put it away for a while, get it out after a few weeks or a couple of months, and go and look at the parts that you like. There will be parts you like, and that's what you want to focus on. Don't worry about the failed parts unless you know you've got a solution for it. Focus on the good parts. Say, how can I do more of that? For the lavender bush on the right, I'm using a color called Periwinkle, made by American Journey, which you can only get through Cheap Joe's. American Journey is specific to Cheap Joe's. I wanted to brighten up those lavender flowers, so I've dabbed in just a little bit of Winsor violet. I've dropped in a little bit of water, and what that's going to do is cause a blossom and texture in those grasses. I'm painting in the base color of the rocks, which is burnt sienna plus whatever green I had in my mixing well. These are the shadows of the rocks. I'm using the leftover green in my mixing well. I'm painting the base color of the rock border around the water garden. This also is burnt sienna with the leftover green in my mixing well. To paint the reflections on the left, I've mixed up a combination of Serpentine Genuine plus Cobalt Blue. This technique starts out as wet on dry. Though this is wet on dry, there is enough commingling of the pigments that I can blend them when I tilt the paper. Now to deepen the value, I'm dropping an Undersea green wet into wet. I've decided I wanted to increase the value of the water. And something that can be really attractive, whether it's water or a street, is to bring your value up from an angle. There's something about it. I think it helps direct the eye into the composition. Adding more value on top of a wash that's already dried is an easy thing to do. I'm just doing another gradient wash. Again, I'm not being perfect about it because it's water, and a little bit of imperfection in that gradient wash will suggest water moving. Again, this painting at this point looks pretty complex. And if you hadn't known the techniques that I used to put in all these shapes and colors, you probably wouldn't have known how to tackle it, depending on your level of experience, of course. As you've seen up to now, I've repeated the same techniques over and over, wet onto dry and wet onto wet. Probably the most difficult thing is to decide when do you want the colors next to each other to blend. If you let each shape you paint dry entirely and then paint the next shape, none of the colors will blend into each other and they'll all look pasted on. I think that might be one of the hardest things to understand about watercolor. I've noticed in social media that people really crave to paint loose watercolors, so it's probably better to err on the side of painting a little too wet than a little too dry. It's interesting how people are drawn to watercolors that are so loose that they almost look abstract. It's almost as if it's more emotional, even if you can't quite tell what it is. Now that I've just spoken about working wetter than you think, I'm working wet onto dry. In this case, what I'm trying to do is add in additional details of the foliage. Well, to achieve that, you need sharp edges, and that means wet on dry. Now I'm getting ready to paint the reflections on the right. I've started out with Undersea green, and then of course the Periwinkle for the reflection of the lavender flowers. Moving into Serpentine Genuine to pick up that lighter green in the garden. And as I move down, I'm starting to add in some cobalt blue to the green to give more of an aqua color. This very dark green here is shadow green. I don't like how it's blending, so I'm spritzing it with water to try to get the paint to run more. Earlier, when I was putting in the reflections on the left, I was putting in some of the shadows on the rocks. Right now, they're the same color as the reflection, so it's not necessarily obvious that those are actually part of the rocks. I'm going back with green that has a little more burnt sienna in it. Well, it looks like I just used some blue there. And then that way, by putting in even darker values on the rocks, you can tell what they are. I'm using an Escoda liner size 6. For painting the shadows on the rocks, I could have used black, either out of a tube or mixed it, but instead what I've chosen to do is to use the green colors that I've already used in the composition. The value is dark enough so you can tell that they're shadows, and yet the painting still has unity because I've used colors that I've already used in the painting. Here's the completed painting. To see another example of a landscape, but this time using mixed greens, check out this video.